He shared his stew with a ragged giant stranger. Next day, hundreds of warriors bowed to him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get started. I could still feel the weight of the warriors' bow as they left my ranch that morning. The quiet, the stillness, the echo of their departure was like a memory carved in stone, and yet, life continued. It felt almost unreal, as if the events of the past 24 hours had unfolded in a dream. I could not shake the feeling that something greater was at play, something I could not fully understand yet. As I went about my work, the heavy scent of the stew from the night before still lingered in the air. It was strange to think that such a simple act could have brought so many people to my door. The warriors had offered me more than just respect. They had given me something I had never asked for: power, authority, and a connection to a world I had only ever heard of in stories. Days passed, and the memory of the tribe's visit stayed with me like a shadow, ever present but distant. Then came the second visit. It was early morning when I first heard the distant pounding of hooves. The sun had barely crested the horizon, and I was still drinking my coffee when the sound reached my ears. At first, I thought it was just a group of travelers, perhaps some ranchers on their way through. But then I saw them, the warriors. They appeared just as suddenly as they had the day before, like a storm rolling over the plains. They rode in silence, a long line of figures on horseback, their faces grim and purposeful. At their head was the giant man, now clad in ceremonial armor, his presence even more imposing than before. I stood frozen at the door, my hand still clutching the mug. Something in the air felt different this time, heavier. The warriors dismounted, forming a circle around me. I had no time to speak or ask questions before the giant man approached. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I saw something else in them, something that went beyond gratitude or respect. "We must speak," he said, his voice firm, carrying the weight of authority. He gestured for me to follow him, and without another word, I did. We walked to the edge of the ranch, away from the others, and the giant man looked at me with a new sense of urgency. "There is a great danger approaching," he began, his tone grave. "The land is changing, and with it, the balance between our people and the settlers. We cannot ignore this any longer." I blinked, unsure of how to respond. The tension in the air was palpable. "What kind of danger?" I asked, my voice shaky. "An army," he replied simply. "An army that threatens everything we have built, everything we hold sacred." The giant man's words hung in the air, thick with meaning. "I didn't ask for this," I said quietly, the weight of his words settling on my chest. "I only offered a meal to a stranger." The man's eyes softened, but his gaze remained intense. "You did more than that," he said. "You showed kindness when the world gave you nothing. That act has rippled through the land in ways you cannot yet see. You have become a symbol." He paused, and I could feel the gravity of his words sinking in. "The warriors, they follow you now. Not because of me, but because of what you have shown them. You will stand with us in the coming battle." His words struck me like a bolt of lightning. I was no leader. I was just a rancher, a man who wanted nothing more than peace. But in that moment, something shifted. The quiet life I had known, the simple days of tending to my animals, had been replaced with a responsibility I had never asked for. And I realized that the moment the warriors had bowed to me, my life had changed forever. They had come to me not just for protection, but for leadership. They had come to me because they believed in the power of kindness, in the power of a man who had done nothing more than share a meal with a stranger. It was a heavy burden to bear, but as the giant man spoke again, I understood. "It is time to make a choice, Jesse," he said, his voice unwavering. "You can turn away, walk back to your cabin, and forget all this. Or you can stand with us. You can fight for something greater than yourself." The decision was mine, and I knew in my heart there was no turning back. This was my moment, my purpose. And in the days that followed, as I prepared for the coming battle, I would discover that the greatest strength a man could possess was not his sword or his arm, but his heart. And as the warriors gathered around me, ready to defend our way of life, I knew that I had made the right choice. I had become part of something much larger than I could have ever imagined. I was not just a rancher anymore. I was a leader, and the fight for our future had just begun. I stood on the edge of my land, looking out at the vast, barren horizon. The warriors had gathered around me, preparing for what lay ahead. It felt surreal. Just a few days ago, I was a simple rancher, living alone, minding my own business. Now, I was about to lead a force of warriors into battle, fighting for something I barely understood. The giant man, whose name I had learned was Kante, had been with me every step of the way. He had shared stories of his tribe, the Redstone Apache, and the long history of conflict and survival that had shaped them. But this battle was different. It wasn't just about defending their land or their people. It was about standing against an invader who threatened to tear everything apart. The sun was setting, casting a fiery glow over the landscape as the campfires flickered to life. I couldn't help but think back to the day I had shared that simple meal with the stranger, not knowing it would lead to this. It was a humbling thought, and one that made me realize the magnitude of the situation. I wasn't just standing with the Apache now. I was standing with all those who believed in justice, in protecting the weak, and in defending what was right. Kante approached me, his presence as commanding as ever. He handed me a knife, its blade polished to a deadly shine. "This is not just a weapon," he said, his voice low but firm. "This is a symbol of your new role. You are not just a rancher anymore. You are a protector, a leader." The weight of the knife in my hand felt heavier than it should have. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't prepared to lead men into battle. But there was no turning back. The warriors had chosen me. They believed in me. And that belief was something I couldn't betray. The night before the battle, I sat by the fire, listening to the crackling of the wood and the murmur of voices around me. The warriors were preparing, sharpening their weapons, discussing strategy. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in my chest. I wasn't a soldier. I had no experience in warfare. All I had was my heart, my willingness to fight for what was right. And I prayed that would be enough. The morning of the battle came quickly. The air was thick with tension as the warriors mounted their horses, ready for the fight. I stood at the front, my heart pounding in my chest as I gripped the knife Kante had given me. The invaders, a band of ruthless mercenaries led by a man named Marshal Voss, were coming from the east. They were well-armed and ruthless, with no regard for the lives they destroyed in their path. But we were ready. The Apache were fighters, skilled in ways I had never imagined. They were experts in the land, in the art of survival. They knew how to move silently through the trees, how to use the terrain to their advantage. As the mercenaries approached, I could feel the weight of the moment. This was it. This was the fight that would define us. The sound of hooves echoed through the valley as the two forces met in the clearing. The clash of steel rang out as the battle erupted, and I found myself in the thick of it, fighting alongside the Apache warriors. It was chaos. The mercenaries were fierce, but they were unorganized, disjointed. The Apache moved with precision, their attacks swift and deadly. I fought with everything I had, not thinking about the danger, not thinking about the outcome. I just fought to protect the people who had come, to believe in me. It wasn't long before the tide turned in our favor. The mercenaries were forced to retreat, their morale shattered by the fierce resistance they encountered. As they fled, I stood on the battlefield, panting, covered in dust and blood. But I felt something I had never felt before: pride. I had done it. We had done it. The warriors had fought for their land, and I had fought alongside them, not as a rancher, but as a leader. As the sun set that evening, casting its final golden rays across the battlefield, the Apache gathered around me. Kante approached, his face stoic but his eyes filled with respect. "You led us well," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You are one of us now." The weight of his words settled in my chest, and I realized that the man I was before this battle was gone. I had changed. I had become something greater than I could have ever imagined. I had become a leader, and with that, I knew there was no going back. I had found my place in this world, alongside the Apache, and together, we would face whatever came next. I stood at the edge of the camp, watching the firelight flicker across the faces of the Apache warriors. The battle was over, the dust had settled, and the mercenaries who had threatened our way of life were gone. But the victory felt hollow. There was no celebration, no joy in the air. Instead, there was a heavy silence that hung over us, as if the battle had only begun. Kante, the giant man who had become both a mentor and a friend, approached me in the quiet of the night. He stood tall, his face marked by the battle, his eyes sharp with a wisdom I had yet to fully comprehend. "You did well," he said, his voice steady but filled with something I had not expected, pride. "But the fight is far from over. There are those who will come for us, who will come for what we have built." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. It was true. The victory today had been only one battle in a much larger war. The land we fought for, the peace we sought to protect, was always under threat. The world was changing, and with it, the balance of power. It was a thought that plagued my mind as I lay awake that night, staring at the stars above. I had never asked for this. I had never asked to become a leader, to be the one who stood between my people and their enemies. But here I was, caught in a world that demanded more than I had ever imagined. The next morning, I was greeted with news that made my heart skip a beat. A messenger had arrived from the west, carrying word of an army gathering near the border. It wasn't just any army. It was a well-organized force, led by a man named Commander Pritchard, a name I had heard whispered in the halls of power, but never expected to face. Pritchard was known for his ruthlessness, his willingness to burn everything to the ground in pursuit of his goals. And now, he was marching toward us. The warriors gathered, their faces grim, their eyes focused on me. They had come to trust me, to follow me, and now it was time for me to prove that I was worthy of their faith. Kante stepped forward, his presence like a shadow that filled the space. "We will stand our ground," he said, his voice unwavering. "But we must be prepared for what is to come. Pritchard will not stop until he has taken everything we hold dear." The words were simple, but the weight of them pressed down on me. I had fought beside these men. I had led them into battle, but now the stakes were higher than ever. We were no longer just defending our land. We were defending our very way of life. The days leading up to the confrontation were filled with preparation. The warriors trained in silence, honing their skills, sharpening their weapons. There was no time for rest, no time for hesitation. We were fighting for everything that mattered. And yet, despite the urgency, there was a strange calm that settled over me. I had never been a warrior, but in the face of this overwhelming challenge, I felt a sense of purpose that I had never experienced before. I knew I was ready. On the eve of the battle, as I stood with Kante at the front of the camp, looking out at the horizon, he turned to me. "You are more than a rancher, Jesse," he said, his voice low and measured. "You are the one who will lead us into this new world. You are the one who will ensure that we survive." His words struck me deeply. I had never thought of myself as a leader, not in the way Kante saw me. But in that moment, I understood. I had been chosen for this, whether I wanted it or not. The next day, as the sun rose over the hills, we marched to meet Pritchard's army. The sound of hooves, the rhythmic pounding of the horses' feet, was like the heartbeat of the land itself. We were united, determined, and ready. As we neared the enemy lines, I could see Pritchard's army in the distance, their soldiers standing like a wall of steel and fire. The battle was about to begin. This time, there would be no turning back. I had come to realize that this was my moment, not just for me, but for all of us. I was no longer just a rancher. I was the leader of the Apache warriors, the one who would stand against the storm and fight for the future of our people. The morning of the battle arrived, the sky a deep orange as the sun began to rise over the horizon. The air was thick with tension, a weight that pressed down on the warriors as they lined up, ready to face the enemy. I stood at the front, my heart pounding in my chest, the weight of my new role heavy on my shoulders. I had never been a fighter, never envisioned myself as a leader of men, yet here I was, standing at the head of a tribe, ready to defend everything we had fought for. Kante, the giant man who had once been a stranger, now stood beside me, his presence reassuring. He had become more than a mentor. He had become a brother. "Stay strong, Jesse," he said, his voice calm but filled with intensity. "This is not just about fighting. This is about our future, our survival." His words echoed in my mind as we prepared to move forward. The Apache warriors, their faces painted with symbols of their tribe, stood ready, their weapons gleaming in the morning light. They were warriors in every sense of the word, skilled, disciplined, and united in their purpose. And now, I was their leader. The enemy was approaching. Fast. I could see their soldiers in the distance, a mass of men on horseback, their flags waving in the wind. They were led by Commander Pritchard, a man known for his cruelty and ambition. But I knew that we were not fighting for land or power. We were fighting for something far more important, our way of life. As the enemy drew closer, I could feel the ground beneath my feet trembling. The sound of hooves was deafening, the dust rising in clouds as the two forces prepared to collide. My hands shook slightly as I gripped the knife Kante had given me, the symbol of my leadership. It was strange, this feeling of power. I had never wanted to be a leader, but now, it was my responsibility. We fight for our families, I said, my voice steady despite the fear rising in my chest. We fight for our future, and we will not back down. The warriors cheered, their spirits lifted by my words. And with that, the battle began. The clash of steel and the cries of warriors filled the air as we charged forward. The mercenaries were well trained, but they were no match for the Apache. We knew the land, the terrain. We moved as one, swift and deadly, striking with precision and speed. The battle was chaotic, the sounds of war echoing through the canyon as arrows flew and swords clashed. I fought alongside the warriors, my heart pounding with every strike, every move. There was no time to think, no time to hesitate. I simply followed the rhythm of the battle, my body moving instinctively. Kante was at my side, his massive frame cutting through the enemy ranks like a force of nature. He was a warrior in every sense of the word, and his presence gave me strength. But even as the battle raged around me, I could feel a shift in the air, a change in the tide. The enemy, once confident in their numbers, began to falter. They were disorganized, unsure of how to handle the fierce resistance from the Apache. I saw Pritchard, leading his men from the front, his face twisted with rage as he realized his army was crumbling. But it was too late. The Apache warriors pressed on, relentless, until the enemy began to retreat. The sound of hooves grew fainter as the mercenaries fled, their morale shattered. And just like that, it was over. The battle was won. The warriors gathered around me, their faces filled with exhaustion but also with pride. We had done it. We had defended our land, our people, and our way of life. But as the dust settled and the reality of the victory began to sink in, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There was still so much to be done, so many challenges ahead. And yet, I knew that as long as we stood together, as long as we fought with the strength of our hearts, we would face whatever came next. Kante approached me, his expression solemn. "You led us well, Jesse," he said, his voice filled with respect. "But this is not the end. It is only the beginning of something much larger." His words hung in the air, and I knew he was right. This battle was just the first step in a larger fight for our future. The land was changing, and we had to change with it. But I was no longer just a rancher. I was a leader, and I would do whatever it took to protect the people who had come to trust me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood with my warriors, looking out over the battlefield. The fight was over for now, but the war for our future had just begun. The days following the battle were filled with both triumph and uncertainty. As the warriors celebrated their hard-won victory, I found myself walking through the quiet remnants of the battlefield, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The clash of steel, the dust, the chaos. It all felt distant now, but the weight of leadership still hung heavy on my shoulders. The Apache warriors had shown me respect, but I was acutely aware that the world was changing and the challenges ahead were far from over. The land we fought for was not just a patch of earth. It was a symbol of our survival, of our identity. And the enemy we faced was not the last. The sound of hooves echoed in the distance as I walked back to camp, and I turned to see Kante approaching. His face was tired, but his eyes were sharp, as always. "We've won a battle, Jesse," he said, his voice steady. "But there is much more to be done. This land is not just ours. It belongs to those who have fought for it, bled for it, and we must protect it." His words hit me harder than any sword or arrow. I had led these warriors into battle, but what came after? The Apache had been fighting for generations, but I was still a stranger in their world, still learning what it meant to be one of them. We could celebrate our victory for a moment, but we could not forget the greater struggle that lay ahead. In the days that followed, we began to fortify our position, preparing for whatever came next. The warriors worked tirelessly, reinforcing the walls of our camp and scouting the land for signs of the enemy. They were relentless, their determination unwavering. And in that determination, I found strength. Kante and I spent hours talking, planning, strategizing. It became clear that our victory had not only made us stronger, it had made us a target. Word of our success would spread, and soon, other forces would come, seeking to take what we had. I had never been prepared for this life. I had been a simple rancher, content with the quiet, simple life I had built. But now, I was at the center of a storm, surrounded by warriors who trusted me, who relied on me. The weight of that trust was both humbling and terrifying. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of red and orange, Kante approached me again. This time, his expression was serious, more serious than I had seen it before. "The enemy is not done with us," he said. "They will come again, and this time, they will bring more than just soldiers. They will bring everything they have. We must prepare." His words were like a cold wind, and I could feel the tension rise among the warriors. They had already proven their strength, their skill, but now, we faced a new challenge. This wasn't just a battle of weapons. It was a battle of wills, of survival. The days turned into weeks, and the quiet tension grew. We trained harder, worked longer. Every moment was spent preparing for the unknown. But even as we did, a sense of unease lingered in the air. It was not the fear of the coming battle that troubled me. It was the realization that the Apache were not just fighting for land. They were fighting for a future, for their children, for their culture. And that future depended on us. As I stood on the ridge, overlooking the land that I had come to call home, I felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over me. The winds of change were blowing, and there was no way to turn back. Kante stood beside me, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Do you feel it, Jesse?" he asked. "The wind of change? It is sweeping through the land, and we must be ready for whatever comes next." I nodded, my heart heavy with the weight of his words. The winds of change were indeed upon us. And as the warriors gathered around me, ready for the challenges that lay ahead, I knew that our fight was far from over. We had won a battle, but the war for our future had only just begun. The days dragged on in a quiet, tense stillness. We had prepared, trained, and fortified our position, but the waiting was harder than any battle. The Apache warriors were ready. I was ready, but what we were waiting for felt like an inevitable storm, something that could not be avoided. We had won the battle before, but I knew the fight for our future had not even begun. The whispers of the enemy's movements had reached us, and the news was worse than we had expected. Pritchard, the man who had led the mercenary forces, was not the only one we had to worry about. Word had spread about our victory, and other forces were gathering, forces that would not hesitate to crush us if given the chance. It became clear that our small victory had drawn more than just the attention of the mercenaries. Now, we faced an alliance of powerful settlers, military commanders, and other figures of authority, all determined to push the Apache back, to reclaim the land we had fought for. Kante and I spent more and more time talking strategy, his wisdom guiding me as we discussed the coming challenges. His leadership was undeniable, but it was my responsibility to lead the Apache into the coming war. I had to be the one to make the hard decisions, the one to stand firm when the ground beneath us seemed to shift. One evening, just as the sun dipped low in the sky, a messenger arrived. He was young, perhaps no older than 16, and his face was set with the seriousness of someone who had seen too much. He had come from a nearby settlement, one where we had established a fragile peace with the locals. His news was troubling, to say the least. "The settlers have begun to move in force," the boy said, his voice strained with urgency. "They've already begun fortifying their position. They're preparing for war." The message hung heavy in the air. I looked to Kante, who had gone silent. His eyes narrowed as he processed the news. "How many?" I asked, my voice steady despite the gnawing fear that had begun to take root. "Hundreds, maybe more," the boy replied. "They've been moving under the cover of night, and they're closing in." Kante's face grew darker. He turned toward the warriors who had gathered around us. "We cannot let them take our land," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "We will not back down." I nodded, feeling the same fire burning inside me. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight for our identity, for everything we had built. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. The warriors set out to scout the enemy's movements, gathering whatever information they could. Kante and I spent long hours strategizing, trying to outthink the settlers who were growing stronger by the day. But no matter how hard we tried to prepare, there was always the nagging feeling that we were fighting a battle we could not win. The settlers were well-armed, well-organized, and they had the full support of the government behind them. We, on the other hand, had the land, the strength of our people, and the belief that we were fighting for something more than just survival. We were fighting for a future that belonged to us, a future that could not be taken. The night before the battle, I stood outside the camp, looking out over the dark plains. The stars shone brightly above, but the air was thick with the tension of the coming storm. Kante joined me, his presence a comforting weight beside me. "Tomorrow will be hard," he said quietly. "But remember this, Jesse. We fight not just for us, but for everyone who has ever believed in the Apache. We fight for those who cannot fight for themselves." His words settled in my heart, and I knew that whatever happened, we had to stand firm. As the warriors gathered the next morning, ready for the battle that would define our future, I felt a strange calm settle over me. It wasn't the calm of a man who had no fear. It was the calm of a man who knew what he had to do, who knew that this was his fight. This was our fight. And together, we would stand against whatever came next. The morning of the battle was cold, a sharp breeze cutting through the air as we gathered on the outskirts of our camp, ready to face the settlers who threatened our land. The warriors were lined up, their faces set with determination, their hands gripping weapons passed down through generations. It was a sight I had seen before, but this time, it was different. I was no longer just an observer. I was a leader, standing with them, ready to fight for what we believed in. Kante stood beside me, his gaze unwavering as he surveyed the battlefield ahead. He had been my guide, my mentor, and now, he was my brother in arms. "This is it, Jesse," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with the weight of experience. "We fight not just for land, but for our way of life. For everything we hold sacred." I nodded, my heart heavy but resolute. I had never asked for this responsibility, but now that it was upon me, I knew there was no turning back. The settlers were coming, led by Commander Pritchard, a man who had made it clear that he would stop at nothing to take what we had. We had fought him once, and now we would fight him again. But this time, the stakes were higher. We were fighting for our future. As we prepared to move forward, I couldn't help but think of everything that had brought me here. From a simple rancher living alone on the plains to the leader of a tribe of warriors, my life had changed in ways I could never have imagined. I had learned that strength was not just about power, but about knowing when to fight and when to stand firm. It was about the bond we shared with each other and with the land that sustained us. The ground beneath my feet felt solid as I looked around at the warriors. I saw fear in some of their eyes, but I also saw resolve. They were ready to fight, to defend their homes, their families, and their future, and I was ready to fight with them. The sound of hooves reached my ears as the enemy approached, their army a cloud of dust in the distance. I could feel my heart beating faster, the adrenaline kicking in. The time for talking was over. Now, it was time for action. We rode toward the enemy, the sound of our horses' hooves pounding in unison, the beat of a drum that only the warriors could hear. As we closed the distance, I could see the settlers' army, their ranks organized and their guns ready. They were prepared, but so were we. We had the advantage of knowing this land, of using the terrain to our benefit. The battle began with a deafening roar as the two sides collided. The clash of steel, the cries of warriors, and the thunder of hooves filled the air. It was chaos, a storm of violence and fury. I fought with everything I had, my knife flashing in the sunlight as I moved through the battlefield, cutting down anyone who came too close. The settlers were fierce, but they were not prepared for the Apache. We moved like shadows, striking quickly and retreating before they could react. I could hear Kante's voice above the din, guiding the warriors, urging them forward. His presence was a beacon in the chaos, and I followed him without hesitation. But even as the battle raged on, I could feel the weight of my decisions pressing on me. This wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about ensuring that we would have a future, that the Apache would survive. The enemy fought hard, but we fought harder. Slowly, they began to falter, their lines breaking as we pushed them back. It wasn't long before they began to retreat, their morale shattered by the fierce resistance they encountered. The warriors, though weary, pressed on, not giving up until the last of the settlers had fled. As the dust settled and the sounds of the battle faded, I stood in the midst of the battlefield, my heart pounding with the rush of victory. But there was no time to celebrate. The settlers may have retreated, but I knew they would return. This battle was just one in a long line of struggles we would face. And as I looked at the warriors around me, their faces covered in dirt and blood, I realized that this fight was not just for us. It was for the generations that would come after us. We had won today, but the war for our future was far from over. Kante approached me, his face weary but proud. "You did well, Jesse," he said, his voice filled with respect. "But this is just the beginning. The future of our people rests in our hands, and we must be ready for whatever comes next." I nodded, knowing that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But we had proven something today. We had proven that the Apache were not to be underestimated. We had proven that we would fight for our land, our people, and our future. And as the sun set behind us, casting its golden light over the battlefield, I knew that no matter what came next, we would stand together. We would face the future with courage, and we would never back down. The days that followed the battle were quieter, but the tension in the air never fully lifted. We had secured our land, for now, but the weight of what had happened and what still lay ahead was never far from my mind. I had led the Apache warriors into battle, and we had fought for our survival. The settlers had retreated, but the threat still loomed over us. Our victory had proven that we could fight, that we could win, but it had also shown us how fragile our position was. The world outside our land was changing. The settlers would return, of that I was certain. They would return with greater numbers, with more weapons, and they would stop at nothing to take what they believed was theirs. But we would not back down. Kante had become a trusted ally, a mentor, and a friend. His wisdom had guided me through the darkest moments, and I knew that together, we would continue to fight for what was right. We spent our days planning, preparing for the inevitable. The warriors trained harder, sharpened their weapons, and honed their skills. Every moment was spent ensuring that we would be ready for the next battle, for whatever would come next. But as the days passed, I realized something important. This was not just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for our future, for our culture, for everything that made us who we were. The Apache were a proud people, and we had endured countless trials and tribulations throughout our history. But we had always fought back, and this time would be no different. One evening, as I stood at the edge of the camp, looking out over the land we had fought to protect, Kante approached me. His face was serious, but there was a spark of hope in his eyes. "Jesse," he said, his voice low but filled with strength, "we have proven that we can fight, but now we must show the world who we are. We must show them that the Apache will not be erased, that we will not be forgotten." His words resonated deep within me. I had come to realize that this fight was about more than just our land or our people. It was about ensuring that our legacy, our way of life, would continue for generations to come. The world was changing, but we were not going to let it change us. We were going to stand tall, stand proud, and face whatever came our way. As the sun set on another day, the warriors gathered around me, their faces tired but filled with determination. We had been through much, but we had never lost hope. The fire that burned in our hearts would never die, no matter how hard the world tried to extinguish it. Together, we would face whatever challenges lay ahead. And as I looked around at the warriors, my brothers and sisters, I knew that no matter what happened, we would survive. We would fight for our future, and we would ensure that the Apache spirit would never be extinguished. This was our land, our people, and our future, and no one, no matter how strong or powerful, could take that from us. The war for our survival was far from over, but we were ready. The Apache had always been a symbol of resilience, of strength, and of honor. And we would continue to fight to ensure that our legacy lived on, no matter what. The battle had been won, but the real war was just beginning. In this gripping tale of survival and honor, the story unfolds against the backdrop of the unforgiving American West. As a simple rancher is thrust into the heart of a conflict he never sought, he must rise to the challenge and lead the Apache warriors in a battle to protect their land and culture. What follows is a fierce struggle for survival, as the rancher transforms into a leader of warriors, guiding his people through perilous challenges. The story, filled with intense action and deep emotional moments, is one of resilience, courage, and the unyielding spirit of the West. Through battles, betrayal, and unexpected alliances, this narrative mirrors the essence of classic Western stories, showing how the smallest acts of kindness can lead to monumental change. As the story progresses, the rancher and his warriors face the powerful forces of settlers determined to take what they believe is rightfully theirs. But with unwavering determination and the wisdom of leaders like Kante, the Apache fight to preserve their land and their way of life. This epic journey highlights the core themes of survival and sacrifice that define Western stories, where characters are tested to their limits. The fierce battles and triumphs underscore the timeless nature of these stories, illustrating how the spirit of the West lives on in the hearts of those who refuse to be conquered. In the end, the rancher realizes that the fight for survival is not just about defending land, but about standing up for a future that ensures the Apache legacy continues. This powerful tale, woven with the threads of hope and hardship, captures the essence of Western stories, where the battle for honor and family never ends.